Hi everyone, welcome to today's video. Today I'm going to be sharing with you the findings from my research on female primary psychopaths. This is a way of sharing my findings without you having to read my massive PhD research. But you know what, if that's your thing, I will share a link at the bottom in the description of this video if you are interested in actually having a look at the full thesis that I wrote on this topic. So my PhD was called The Masked Prevalence and Cost of Working with Female Primary Psychopaths in the Community Services Sector. Now I did my PhD through Curtin University in Western Australia and I finished at the end of 2024 and graduated early 2025. But it wasn't an easy task to get to this point. I had to apply multiple times through lots of different universities, and the biggest problem I found with my research was that because I was actually being critical of women, I think most universities were uninterested in allowing me to do that. I mean, if I was doing a study on male psychopaths in the workplace, I'm pretty sure universities would have been lining up, but because I was talking about women, it was a real issue. They never actually said that outright, but I'm pretty sure that was the problem. And I know that because I had to keep changing the nature of my PhD. Some universities said I needed to do just general psychopaths in the workplace. I couldn't look at specifically women. Others said I needed to, I think it was the psychology department I applied through, said that I needed to look at resilience in the workplace rather than psychopathic behaviour. Someone else said I needed to look at the dark triad rather than just psychopaths, but also psychopaths, narcissists, Machiavellianism as well. But I was very defiant and I stuck with my guns. It took me 3 years to actually have my PhD accepted to a university, and like I said, that was with Curtin University in Western Australia, because I wanted to do the topic I wanted. I figured because scholarships were very challenging to get, and I did almost get a scholarship at one stage, and then COVID hit and every man and his dog wanted to do a PhD, so it made it even much harder. So I decided I would just self-fund my PhD. I was really lucky to get a scholarship in the second year of my PhD because I had proven myself and proven the nature of my study and the importance of it. So it's something I'm very proud of. But I'd like to share with you how I got to this point. You know, anyone who does a PhD, you'll know that it has to be something you're passionate about. It has to actually be something that you really enjoy. Now, initially, I'd had a few bad experiences in the community services sector. I'd been speaking to other women in the sector because it was very much female dominated. 80% of the community services sector is female. And there were many other women that were having similar experiences to me that had been really traumatised by their experiences of how they'd been targeted by other women in the sector. So it got me thinking about this topic. One day I was travelling in Tasmania and I was listening to an audio book by a gentleman by the name of Kevin Dutton. It was called The Wisdom of Psychopaths. I'll show you the book. Fabulous book. Absolutely fabulous book. So I was listening to it on an audio book. It was so good I had to go and buy the actual hard copy. And he was talking all about psychopaths, everyday psychopaths, people in business, people who you're in a relationship with, people who you're friends with. And I found this extremely fascinating because up until that point, I just thought psychopaths was the kind of people that, you know, committed mass murder. They weren't people that could exist in everyday life. So that was my real light bulb moment where I went, oh, that's the kind of people I'm working with. That's the kind of person I've been working with. It was a real turning point for me. And up until that point, I've been doing a PhD on public value in organisations, and I decided that I was no longer going to finish that. I'd already spent a few years on it, and I went, you know what? I actually want to do something way more exciting. This is really, really boring. So let's talk about the study. So what I wanted to know, there was a few things I wanted to know. I wanted to know the prevalence of female primary psychopaths working in the community services sector. And I wanted to look at, could we determine how many there were out there? I wanted to know the impact, the overall impact on the workforce when there was a psychopath present. And I also wanted to know whether these female bullies in the workplace were that bad that they could actually be classed as psychopathic, and whether they fit the psychopathic criteria. So the interesting thing is, in the end, I didn't actually determine the prevalence because that was way too hard to do. Unless I looked at specific cases and a specific organisation, that was the only way I was ever going to get prevalence. But what I did get was some really great information around the specific impact and the specific behaviours that people were witnessing in workplaces that was psychopathic. And it was actually really surprising for me how many of the people I interviewed worked with someone that fit that criteria. That was actually quite shocking for me. I didn't expect to find so many. I expected to find bullies and people that wanted to target others for whatever reason, but I certainly didn't expect to find as many as I did that fit the criteria. So the criteria that I used was the Psychopathic Management Scale, which was created by Professor Clive Boddy and Associates, and he was actually one of my PhD supervisors, and it was really awesome to have him on my team. So it's a research version specifically for that purpose. It's not a psychological test. It's really just determining whether someone's behaviour in the workplace fits with the psychopathic criteria. So that was the criteria I used. Now my study looked at, I did a mixed method study, which for those who don't know what that is, that means I did both qualitative and quantitative data collection. So qualitative is when you actually speak to people, so that I did that through interviews. And the quantitative was the survey. So that's where you collect specific information through things like surveys, and you can quantify that data. I wanted to do both because I really wanted to be able to gather case studies that were very specific, where I could actually sit and have conversations with people and learn more about their experiences and how impactful it was. Because sometimes with a survey, you're only getting the information that you're asking for, whereas in an interview, face-to-face, you can actually ask those additional questions and get that additional information. So I found that the mixed method study was really, really useful, and the case studies of people that had experienced psychopathic behaviour were quite harrowing, and many of them said to me how it was really therapeutic for them to talk about their experience, because they hadn't really had the opportunity to talk about it. It was also really heart-wrenching to see how many people who had worked with psychopathic females had been permanently damaged as a result of the behaviour that they had not only witnessed but been a part of and been targeted with. Most people had either left their job or been pushed out of their job as a result of that behaviour. Many of them were asked to sign non-disclosure agreements, so a lot of them couldn't talk about what happened to them, but because of the confidentiality of the study, they were able to talk to me. So in terms of analysing those case studies that were part of the interviews, what I did was what's called a thematic analysis. So if you're not familiar with what that is, it's where you take text, sometimes it might be focus groups or interviews, and you look through the content and come up with key themes that come out of that content. So where is there overlap between the different people that you've interviewed? So when I ended up interviewing, I think, about 15 people. I came up with 4 key themes in the end, and I'm going to read those to you now. So the 4 key themes I came up with were primary psychopathic behaviour in females was often disguised behind relationships, friendships, and victimhood. So this was a really interesting one. I found that a lot of people had female primary psychopaths, and I use the term primary because primary psychopaths are psychopaths that are everyday psychopaths. So people that can function day to day. They're less impulsive than what's called a secondary psychopath. So secondary psychopaths are more like the criminal psychopaths that may commit murder. Erin Patterson, who killed her family, she probably fits more into that category. They can be quite impulsive and less reserved, whereas a primary psychopath can often lie in wait for a long period of time before their behaviour comes to light and they're identified as someone that's a problem in the workplace. So in my interviews, I found that many of these difficult, toxic women who fit the psychopathic criteria would develop really good relationships with people that meant they were safe within their role. So they might be, I know there was one case where the woman was best friends with the deputy CEO. There was another case where someone was fabulous friends with higher management so they could keep their job. And friendships, so there was one person I spoke to who, because I interviewed people in Tasmania, a very small place, they moved jobs because of a psychopath and found out they went from working for a psychopathic person who'd done quite a bit of damage to working for a friend of that person, not realising that was the case until they were already employed. The other thing is victimhood, and the reason I've included that in this criteria is that I found that many female psychopaths play the victim. So I'm the one that's being bullied. I'm the one that's the victim here. I'm the one that's been targeted. I've been misrepresented. I've been misinterpreted. So really pretending that they're not the problem, that they're actually the victim in the case, which makes it really hard. How do you discipline someone who thinks they're not the problem, who's not able to self-reflect, which is a big problem with psychopaths. They can't self-reflect. They don't have that empathy. It's always everybody else's fault. So often they would play the victim. And that's something women do a lot more than men. They move into that victim role because it's easy to do that and then not get into trouble. Nobody wants to yell at someone who's a victim. Nobody wants to criticise someone who is a victim. So the second theme that I came up with was that the target of the female primary psychopath, so the person actually being bullied by the psychopath in the workplace, their behaviour was psychologically, emotionally and professionally damaging. So they were impacted at 3 levels. So often people were emotionally unwell as a result of the behaviour. They were quite depressed, suicidal. They were crying in their car before they went to the office. They couldn't get out of bed of a weekend. They struggled to look after their children and maintain hobbies. They were emotional all the time. It didn't take much for them to become quite upset. And you would expect that from any kind of bullying behaviour. The added impact on top of that is that professional impact as well. So especially in Tasmania, it's a very small place. It's like a small country town. And if you have pissed off a psychopath in one organisation, especially in the community sector, it doesn't take much for that person to make sure that other people in the sector know. And I spoke to a number of people who said they would never work in Tasmania again in this sector. And that was really quite sad because it's although there was this extra power that was held in Tasmania around manipulating that sector to a big degree. So yeah, that was really sad because I know a lot of people have had to move interstate, not able to work here anymore as a result. The third criteria was the female primary psychopath used behaviours that including treating others with disdain, being judgmental and responding with a lack of empathy. So these are all criteria that psychopaths do use. They use disdain, they use judgment, they are unempathetic. So I know a number of people I spoke to talked about having a psychopathic manager who would deny them leave to attend family events, important events like weddings and funerals, deny them leave for important occasions that they wanted to be a part of. And often there was no reason behind that, no logical reason. It was just simply that the female psychopath wanted to exert their control over a person they didn't like or they were jealous of. And that was really common amongst the participants. The participants I spoke to weren't just women as well. I spoke to men and women who'd experienced working with a female psychopath. So the fourth theme that I came up with from the interviews was that female primary psychopathic behaviour included dishonesty, relational aggression, manipulation and gaslighting. So these are some really key traits of a psychopath. You know, the lying is a big one, being really dishonest. Relational aggression is the use of social isolation and social damage, so gossip, rumours, you know, after work drinks but you're not invited, that kind of thing. Spreading rumours and things that are not true, that's also relational aggression. And future videos will cover some of this stuff in more detail. Manipulation, obviously manipulating the situation, and also gaslighting. So, oh no, I didn't say that. I know what you're talking about. Making you feel like the idiot. And that's really common as well. So these were the 4 key themes that came out of those interviews. So I then used those interviews and those findings from that to then inform the survey. So in the survey, I looked at relational aggression, I looked at psychopathic criteria, we also looked at job satisfaction and also the psychopathic level of the actual participant completing the survey. So I want to point out that when I did the survey, when I did the interviews and when I recruited participants, I didn't actually use the term psychopath. I used the term difficult or toxic. I think I used toxic with the interviews, but I used difficult colleague with the survey because I didn't want to sway people's opinion. As we all know, if someone pisses us off enough, we're going to call them names. We're going to think much worse of them than they actually are. And that's really common human behaviour. So I really didn't want to sway people. I didn't want them to fully understand what the study was about, because I wanted them to be a little bit objective about how they rated people on the scale. So the scales weren't identifiable to the survey participants and also to the people doing the interview, who also were given the criteria for the psychopath. For the interviews, I did actually tell them at the end of the interview what I was actually studying, just to get information. But I didn't tell them until they were completed the standard questions. I will say that speaking to the interviewees, although it was very therapeutic for them, I felt really privileged that many of these people were willing to tell me their stories, and their stories that were really harrowing, that had affected them so much personally and professionally. And it was nice to actually hear from many participants how helpful it was for them to talk about it and to help them feel like they weren't the problem. And I think that was really important, and that was certainly something I'll always take away from this study, that I was able to, although I was collecting data for a study, I really felt like I helped people by just allowing them to share their story and have someone listen and understand what was going on for them. So like I said, after I did the interviews, I did the survey, and that was really, really interesting as well. And similar things kind of came out of that. So there was a real lack of ability of organisations to actually deal with bad behaviour in the workplace. And that was something that came out across both the interviews and the survey. People were really disheartened by organisations and often left as a result, because they just felt like the more they tried to complain, the more they became the problem. And I think that's a real big issue when you're working with a psychopath, is that they're able to remain calm while you become escalated. And that's a massive problem, because, you're becoming reactive. So you then become the bully, you then become the problem. And from an organisational perspective, they can actually visually see the behaviour that you're doing that needs to be dealt with. Whereas a psychopath will remain calm. They keep their behaviour quite hidden, and certainly female psychopaths are a lot more covert than male psychopaths. So it's really hard to pinpoint things like relational aggression and target that to a point where it can be performance managed, or you can deal with the psychopath. So often it was the victim that would end up leaving or end up being disciplined, which is a huge issue. So one of the interesting things that I think surprised a lot of people was me wanting to actually look at female psychopaths in a helping profession. And it surprised me too when I started to really look at this topic much closer, even before I started, was that how much of a problem it was. And the thing that puzzled me the most was, why would someone who doesn't care about others, who doesn't hold that level of empathy that's needed in a community organisation, so social workers, psychologists, counsellors, that kind of thing, why would they be psychopathic? It didn't make any sense to me. And as time went on during my study, I came to understand that it was actually way more obvious than I expected it to be. And there have been studies done around this, that often you'll find that females, whereas a male psychopath might move into something like a corporate sector where they can, commit fraudulent behaviour within a corporate structure, a female psychopath is more likely to move into a helping profession where their level of control is control over resources, control over people. So you think about a community organisation that provides, say, financial assistance, housing assistance, or even therapy, talk therapy. The level of control that the worker has in the wrong hands could easily allow someone to feel powerful, having control over someone's emotional and financial and physical resources that they need to survive. So I like to use the analogy of the firefighter that might start a fire, and we've all heard about that happening before. Not all firefighters, it's not everybody. Let's leave the hate out of the comments. A firefighter who starts a fire to then rush in and save people. There's this real heroism aspect to it, that they start the fire so then they can be the hero. There's a case of a woman by the name of Lucy Letby in the UK who killed multiple premature babies, and then once she had done that, she was able to then insert herself into the family to help them, to be there for them as a supporter. And it's believed, that's why she did it. So she could actually comfort them in their time of grief, which is quite sickening when you think about it. So one of the other things that I looked at in the survey in particular was the relationship that the female psychopath had to the individual they were targeting. So the person that participated in the survey and the individual they were targeting. What I found was really, really interesting, because you hear a lot about psychopaths, psychopathic managers and CEOs and how they target their subordinates. What I found with women, though, was that they didn't care whether it was their manager, their subordinate or their peer, that there was an actual equal divide between the three groups. So although what I expected to find was that it was the managers that would target the subordinates, that wasn't the case, that as many people were targeted by their manager as they were targeted by a direct peer or a subordinate themselves, because that was also happening, that people were being targeted up. So someone that a manager might manage, they were actually using their behaviour to target their own manager and bully their own manager. And this is not something we see in men. Men are more likely to target from a position of power. So as a CEO or a manager, they're more likely to target down, so to their subordinates, whereas that was not the case for women. And I think because women see power differently, I think women see power in other women in different ways. I think women, I'm a woman myself, I understand, I get it. You know, we might judge other women in a way that it might be about how they look, how they dress, the qualifications they have. I mean, I've worked in places before where I've been overqualified for a position and there's a real sense of jealousy there. So often people might try and talk down to you to make you reduce your self-esteem to make themselves feel better. And that's often something that you see in women a lot more than you do in men. And that's because women value those personal relationships more than men do. Men are less likely to care if someone starts ignoring them at work. Men are more likely to go, oh, I just don't give a shit, I'm just here to do my job. So women are more likely to use relationships in the workplace to manipulate things. I remember one of the interview participants telling me that they saw a male in the workplace that had started being targeted by the female psychopath, and now he had made himself useless to the psychopath. He no longer had resources she needed, and he distanced himself from her and was quite able to do that, and therefore stopped being a target of her behaviour. And I think this is way easier for men to do in the workplace when they're being targeted by a woman than it is for women. Because if a woman is rejected by another woman, it's way more hurtful than when they are rejected by a friendship from a man. So just something to keep in mind. So the other thing that's really key when it comes to female conflict is relational aggression. So relational aggression is very much about affecting someone's social standing, using gossip and rumours to reduce someone's value socially. It's often been called a female behaviour. And if you search relational aggression, often it's all about mean girls and queen bees and along those lines. But it's also been studied that it is often one of the signs of psychopathy in the workplace from women. They'll use things like relational aggression, whereas many of studies said that men don't use that same approach. So that was certainly something I found. The women were using a lot of relational aggression, and even if they didn't fit the psychopathic criteria, they certainly, if they were bullying, they certainly fit the relational aggression criteria as a means of targeting other women. The interesting thing that did come out of the study was that the male psychopaths that I did find in the sector, they also used relational aggression, which is not what I expected to find. So my thinking around that, given it's a survey, I couldn't actually ask more detail. My thinking is that a psychopath, what they'll do is they'll get to know someone and they'll get to know your weaknesses. And they'll use whatever weaknesses they can find to target you. So my thinking is a male psychopath in a female-dominated industry like the community services sector would use relational aggression, because if they're targeting, and to target a woman, I didn't find any male-to-male psychopaths in my study, but I did find males who targeted females as well. It wasn't many, and that's because of the female-dominated industry. There aren't a lot of men in that industry. But those that did use relational aggression. And my thinking is that they saw that as a weakness for their target. They knew that using relational aggression on a female target would have the biggest impact. So that's why they used it. So although it's often seen as a female behaviour, it's often seen as a female use of aggression rather than physical aggression, I think that a male primary psychopath would also use it, knowing that it can be extremely damaging to a female target. So that was a really interesting point, and I'd really love to look at that more. It was a very small sample of male psychopaths that I found in my study because, like I said, it was a female-dominated industry, but it's certainly an interesting thought that I'd like to look at much further. But like I said, I believe that comes down to male psychopaths choosing the most damaging behaviour to target a woman. So one of the other things I looked at was job satisfaction. I'm not going to go into great detail on that, only because it is well known that psychopaths in the workplace, if there's a psychopath in the workplace, you'll often find lower levels of job satisfaction. Less psychopathic behaviour, you'll find higher levels of job satisfaction. So that was just another way of testing the situation in the workplace. Yeah, so there was some really interesting findings that came out of what I studied and just hearing people's stories. I am hoping to write a book on my PhD findings. I'm not sure when that'll be out. I keep writing it and then coming back to it later. So certainly if you follow my channel, I'll certainly let you know once that is out and done and available, but it's probably going to be 12 months away. I have, like I said, I'll share the PhD link in the description of this video so that you can look at my PhD if you are interested. It's important to me that I do share that evidence so that you know that what you're getting from me isn't just me making something up, it's actual proper evidence. So I hope you've enjoyed this summary of my PhD. Look, I really want to thank my supervision team, Dr. Sharon Curran, Dr. Clive Boddy and Dr. Rohini Balumi. They were fabulous and stuck by me throughout my supervision, especially Sharon. Sharon and I are going to be lifelong friends after studying this topic, and we still regularly chat about the issue of female psychopaths in the workplace. Like I said, I'll put a link to my PhD in the description if you're interested in reading it. I'm hoping to put a book out in the future. But I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe. Please leave a comment if it's something that you're interested in. And I'm looking forward to doing a lot more videos around how to wrangle toxic women. Thanks for listening.